It's my distinct pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker today, Sir Jonathan Bate. But before I do, a very important note on our classical sponsor today for this keynote, the Classical Academic Press. Very important in the classical education work that we all do together. Classical Academic Press, CAP, is a classical education curriculum, media, and consulting company. They are the product of years of brainstorming, conversations, thoughtful critiques, and application in private, public charter, and homeschool classrooms. Their mission is to produce and supply to today's market the finest classical curriculum and resources available. They publish Latin, logic, writing and rhetoric, grammar, Greek, Spanish poetry, literature guides, and much, much more. They seek to produce classical curricula and media with a clear design and structure and incremental and systematic instruction, all with a touch of delight, creativity, joy, and flair. And as you exit the hall today, you'll see the CAP booth right outside the doors here. What a distinct pleasure it is to introduce Sir Jonathan Bate, Regents Professor of Literature and Foundation Professor of Environmental Humanities at Arizona State University and a Senior Research Fellow at Oxford University, where he was formerly Provost of Worcester College. He is the author of 20 books, including prize-winning biographies of the writers William Shakespeare, William Wordsworth, John Clare, and Ted Hughes. He has been on the board of the Royal Shakespeare Company and edited their editions of Shakespeare's complete works and collaborative plays. He co-curated the Shakespeare show in the British Museum that was the centerpiece of the cultural festival during the 2012 London Olympic Games. And Being Shakespeare, his one-man play for Simon Callow, premiered at the Edinburgh Festival and toured the United Kingdom and has had 3 runs in London's West End and even played in New York, Chicago, and Trieste. He is the chair of the Hawthornden Foundation, supporting creative writers with residencies in Brooklyn, Lake Como, and a Scottish castle. We have been blessed to have Sir Jonathan at the symposium, I think, for 3 years now. And I'd also just add a little biographical note, too. His son, Harry, attended a Great Hearts High School here in Arizona, Scottsdale Prep. Without further ado, please let me welcome to the podium Sir Jonathan Bate.
Thank you, Daniel, for that generous introduction. What you have just seen is what my lecture is about. That is to say, I want to try to show you that the classical education that William Shakespeare got made him into the actor and then the dramatist that he became. Because what Shakespeare did in school is exactly the kind of thing that Eleanor has just done. And this is completely spontaneous. I didn't know this was going to happen. But a key part of the education, the classical education that Shakespeare got in the schoolroom illustrated here, is he had to learn poems and then to stand up and recite them and perform them. So if you think about how Shakespeare began to create his beautiful poetry, began to think about the imagination, again, that quotation of Eleanor's own words, that the most important thing in childhood is the cultivation of imagination. Shakespeare thought exactly the same. His imagination was stimulated by his classical education, and in his classroom, he would have stood up, he would have recited poetry, and indeed, together with his fellow students, they would have put on plays. Daniel mentioned my son Harry had a fantastic experience at Scottsdale Prep, and one of the distinctive things about a Great Hearts education is that everybody has to take part in a play, a Shakespeare play. And that was exactly the case for Shakespeare himself. So as I say, in many ways, my lecture has been preempted by that performance. But let me just give a bit of historical context, because what I want to suggest to you is that what you are doing in fostering, reviving, and bringing forward the idea of a classical education is you are entering into a great tradition that goes back hundreds and hundreds of years. And it was out of that classical education that we got the works of Shakespeare. The illustration you see behind you is the schoolroom of the King Edward Grammar School in the little provincial Midland England town of Stratford-upon-Avon. Shakespeare went there for free. I guess it was a kind of charter school. He went for free because his father was a town councillor, and it was called a grammar school. Why was it called a grammar school? Because they spent most of their time studying grammar, Latin grammar, from morning to night. That meant that Shakespeare and his contemporaries became fluent in the Latin language, in the structure of Latin and the rhetoric that was encouraged by Latin, and began to study the classic texts. Here is the textbook that they would have begun with, the 8 parts of the Latin grammar by a man called William Lilly. It's interesting that a descendant of Lilly became a dramatist himself, a man called John Lilly, who was very influential upon Shakespeare. So the grammar, and then the art of rhetoric, the use of language in order to persuade your audience. This was a crucial part of the education. Now, let's ask ourselves why, in the Tudor period, the 16th century, Shakespeare's time, why there was a great expansion of educational opportunities for boys. It was only boys who went to these grammar schools. Girls would have gone to a so-called petty school where they'd have learnt some basic literacy. But obviously in that society, it was only the absolute elite. It was only aristocratic young women who got a full-scale classical education. What we need to remember is that the Tudor period, the time of Henry VIII, and then the turbulent years of the mid-century, and then the triumphant reign of Queen Elizabeth, was a time when England was really trying to establish itself as a modern nation. Historians sometimes speak of the Tudor Revolution in government. And what they mean by that is that in that Tudor period, if any of you have watched the TV dramatization of Hilary Mantel's novels, Wolf Hall, Bring Up the Bodies, you have that figure of Cromwell, who's a great administrator. So this Tudor period is really the time when the government tries to get a grasp on the whole nation. And it does so through developing a bureaucracy, through developing a system of local government, through a lot of developments in the law, through an element of democracy by giving more power to Parliament. That's a way of creating a kind of cohesion in the nation, which of course was much needed as a result of the religious Reformation, where the break from Roman Catholicism divided the nation. And it's also a time where there's war on the continent, a very strong sense of the nation being under threat from the powerful Spanish Empire. So all sorts of ways in which a form of nation building is needed. And in order to do that, you need a more educated middle class. You need to be educating boys to become civil servants, lawyers, secretaries to the great households. In a sense, it is the time when the very modern idea of the state, perhaps even the deep state, is invented. So that's why a whole lot of new grammar schools open up. So 1547 is when the Stratford-upon-Avon Grammar School opens, and there's lots of other examples. It is very similar to the sense of classical charter schools being opened across this country as a sense of there being a real sense of need to build a common heritage, a sense of identity. Now, of course, what happens when you have a bunch of very smart young people being given this education is they're not all going to choose the route of going into the law or going into the civil service, becoming bureaucrats. Some of them are thinking, hey, this language, this art of persuasive speech that we've learnt in school, why don't we create our own culture by following that example? And so it is that one of the things that emerges out of the Tudor educational revolution, as I would call it, is the birth of a professional entertainment industry. Fixed theatres where you have a professional acting company, a repertoire, a box office. Literally, it's called the box office because there was a box where people would put their money in when they came to see the show. That professional theatre industry emerges in the 1560s, the 1570s, precisely because of the classical education that the future actors and dramatists have got. Just thinking for a moment about that art of rhetoric, one of the things that you learn in the art of rhetoric is to see both sides of an argument. You can see how that would be a good training for a lawyer. A lawyer might have to work for the prosecution one week and the defense the next week. So that sense of using language to set up debates, to see that there's always two points of view. That's a very valuable skill for a lawyer, but it's also a valuable skill for a future dramatist, because once you get into the theatre, what you're going to want to do is have a whole bunch of characters with different points of view and have them debating with each other. The theatre, in some sense, being like a courtroom with the audience as judges. Another key aspect of rhetoric, and Aristotle says this about rhetoric, sorry, I just advanced too quickly there, is the idea that you use examples. Examples are most available to deliberative speeches, says Aristotle, for we judge of future events by divination from past events. Deliberative rhetoric is the idea of putting forward ideas and arguments through your rhetorical speeches. And Aristotle says one of the best ways you do that is by taking examples from the past. You want an example of heroism, you will tell a story from the Trojan War. You want an example of family conflict, you take an example from Oedipus, not a very happy family story. So that idea that you use what they called exemplars, in Latin, paradigma, paradigms, a model from the past as a way of shaping the present. And of course, this is exactly what you do in offering a classical education. You get your students to read a great text from the past and apply the ideas from that text to the present. This is exactly what Aristotle recommends, what the rhetorical theorists of the 16th century recommend, and what Shakespeare learns. So, as well as the rhetoric, there's also the art of studying the texts themselves. What books readeth your master unto you? That's a question that is asked in a translation exercise in a language textbook printed in 1591 by a man called Richard Field, who went to school with Shakespeare. Richard Field, another Stratford boy, went to London, was apprenticed to a printer, and indeed when Shakespeare wanted his poems printed, he went to his school friend Richard Field, and Field printed Shakespeare's poems, Venus and Adonis and Lucrece. Venus and Adonis, incidentally, became the best-selling poem of the Elizabethan period. So in this textbook, it says, what books should you read in school? He readeth Terence, Virgil, Horace, and Tully's offices. Tully is another name for Cicero. Cicero, the great artist of rhetoric. So Terence, the exemplar of the art of comedy. Comedies that involve young people who fall in love. Maybe the parent doesn't want them to marry, but a clever servant helps out. They overcome various obstacles, and they do end up getting married. The basic structure of comedy that Shakespeare learns. Virgil, the nation-building story for ancient Rome, the story of Aeneas' escape from Troy and establishment of the Roman Empire. Horace, who writes satires, satirizing sort of contemporary politics, but also writes a lot about the virtues of simplicity, of a country life as opposed to a city life. And Cicero, the art of rhetoric and the art of thinking about politics. So if we think of Polonius in Hamlet for a moment, you remember he talks about when the actors arrive and how the acting company who come to Elsinore are capable of performing in any literary genre, in comedy, in tragedy. Do you remember he sort of says Plautus, who with Terence, the founder of ancient Roman comedy, Plautus cannot be too light, nor Seneca, the founder of Roman tragedy, nor Seneca too heavy. The players can do everything. They can be tragical, they can be comical, they can be historical, just as Shakespeare was. They can be tragical, comical, historical, pastoral. Shakespeare learns the art of comedy and dramatic structure from Terence. Horace, the art of moral reflection within poetry. And as I say, the idea that there can be a good life in the country, the art of pastoral. The art of pastoral also to be found in Virgil, who before he wrote the heroic or epic Aeneid, wrote his pastorals, the eclogues, lyrical poems in which shepherds sing of the delights of country life, just as we get in a play such as You Like It. And from Cicero, the art of rhetoric, political theory, questions about tyranny versus republicanism, and the idea of civic duty. One of Cicero's key texts that was studied was called De Officiis, which is about the way in which society depends upon mutual obligations between people. Ovid was also studied. Ovid not mentioned in that previous quotation, but Ovid was studied for his love poetry, the Amores, the Ars Amatoria, the Heroides. But above all, the Metamorphoses. Ovid's Metamorphoses was this great collection of all the myths and stories of ancient Greece translated into Rome, and it was Shakespeare's favorite book. Shakespeare liked to take a shortcut, and so rather as you would have your students who have not studied Latin, let alone the Greek or the Italian in the case of Dante, you would rely on good translations from the classics. And it was exactly the same for Shakespeare. Once he left school, he wanted to keep up his reading of the classics, but he didn't want to go back with all that Latin grammar. He had had enough of that at school. So he worked with translations. And the Elizabethan period was a great period of translation from the classics. Again, this was part of the kind of nation-building experience to give the English people, to give a broader audience, women as well as men, people who didn't have Latin, to give them the experience of the classics. In 1567, a man called Arthur Golding translated the whole of Ovid's Metamorphoses, and this became Shakespeare's favourite book. He went back to it again and again and again. In his early play, Titus Andronicus, a copy of Ovid's Metamorphoses is actually brought on stage and is a key part of the plot. In his later play, Cymbeline, there's a description of a character reading the Metamorphoses at bedtime. And in his final solo-authored play, The Tempest, the moment when Prospero renounces his magic, ye elves of hills and standing lakes and groves, is a straight translation out of Ovid's Metamorphoses. it wasn't only Shakespeare. 1564, the same year that Shakespeare was born, another grammar school boy, Christopher Marlowe, was born. He went to the grammar school in Canterbury in Kent, and a very similar story. He becomes obsessed with Ovid, and he actually translated from Ovid's Amores, Ovid's elegies, he called them, these love poems. And what we see is that the art of the love poetry that he translates in one book, he then, in another sense, translates it onto the stage in his play Dr. Faustus, one of the most frequently performed, influential and successful plays of the era. This is a love poem of Ovid's, and Marlowe calls it To the Dawn, Not to Hurry. The idea is dawn is coming on, but the lover does not want the dawn to come. Sounds very familiar from Romeo and Juliet, doesn't it? In an indirect way, Shakespeare is also going to quote that. But in Dr. Faustus, you remember Faustus makes a compact with the devil. He's allowed all the pleasures of the world for a period, in return for which he will ultimately have to give his soul to Beelzebub. And towards the end of the play, when he's about to be dragged down to hell, he asks for time to stop. And he actually quotes, O lente currite noctis equi. Slow down the horses of the night. Go slowly. He's actually quoting from Ovid within the speech on the stage. I guess not everybody in the audience would have understood the Latin line, but the context makes it clear. But there's no doubt that it's that studying of Ovid in school that has made that possible for Marlowe, for Faustus. And so too, it's the case with Juliet. If we think of the great scene in Romeo and Juliet, where Juliet is willing on the night, she wants Romeo to come to her to consummate their marriage. And whereas Faustus says, slow down those horses of time, Juliet says, speed them up. Gallop apace, you fiery-footed steeds, towards Phoebus' lodging. Come night, come Romeo, come thou day in night. So in this great speech of Juliet's, Shakespeare's study of Ovid, and probably his knowledge of his rival dramatist Marlowe, leads him to make his own creativity, allows his own imagination to spark as a result of that classical inspiration. Once he left school, he went to a London that was steeped in the influence of the classical world. If one looks at a couple of famous illustrations, you can see that. At the top there is the famous long view of the City of London. And at the bottom, in the centre, on the south bank of the River Thames, you can see the theatres. But if one looks along the top, the inscription is describing London as a great city. Again, part of this idea of nation building. London's going to be the new Rome. Just as once the Roman Empire dominated the world, the hope is that a time will come when Britain will become an empire and dominate the world. And in order to express that idea, the caption written there is in Latin. Similarly, when a Dutch visitor came to the London Theatre and provided a sketch of one of the London theatres, it's really the only sketch we have of the interior of the open-air Elizabethan theatre. Incredibly important drawing. Inspires, obviously, the reconstructed Globe Theatre in London, and indeed there are several reconstructed Globes across America, in San Diego, for example. But the way that it's labelled, that it's illustrated, the proscenium, the different parts of the theatre, again, in the Latin language. I've been fascinated for a long time about this whole sense of the classical influence on Shakespeare, and wrote a sorry, little plug here. Wrote a book about it a few years ago called "How the Classics Made Shakespeare," and one of the examples I took there was a simple example, really, to do with a landmark in London. At the top image there, you can see the Tower of London, the famous White Tower. Still stands in London today, as I'm sure any of you who have been to London with a party of school kids will know. Now, of course, that was really built by William the Conqueror. It was a kind of symbol of the Norman conquest of England in 1066. But in Shakespeare's time, many people believed that it had actually originally been built by Julius Caesar when the Romans conquered England. And there's a couple of moments in Shakespeare, one in Richard II and one in Richard III, where there are particular, very specific references to that idea of the Tower of London being built by Julius Caesar. When Richard II has been dethroned, we have a line when he's being taken off, and the Queen says, "This way the king will come. This is the way to Julius Caesar's ill-erected tower, to whose flint bosom my condemned lord is doomed a prisoner by proud Bolingbroke." You remember in Richard II, Henry Bolingbroke, who becomes Henry IV, has taken the throne. Richard II is imprisoned in the tower. And the flint bosom of the tower is a brilliant image, isn't it? Typical Shakespeare, packing so much meaning into a single word. Because if you look at the exterior of the Tower of London, the stone is indeed flint. But at the same time, the idea of a flint bosom suggests hard-heartedness. It's a metaphor as well as a literal image. And then in Richard III, one of the boy princes, who rather unfortunately end their life in that Tower of London, on the way there, says this, Prince Edward, "I do not like the tower of any place. Did Julius Caesar build that place, my lord?" To which Buckingham, Richard's henchman, says, "He did, my gracious lord, begin that place, which since succeeding ages have re-edified." So the idea that Julius Caesar began to build it and then it was kind of rebuilt in later ages. To which the prince said, "Is it upon record or else reported successively from age to age he built it?" Buckingham, "Upon record, my gracious lord." I rather like that exchange. It's a little bit like a moment in a kind of Greatheart's humane letters class where they're debating the text. You know, what's the textual evidence? The prince is saying, is it just a story? Is it just a kind of a piece of oral tradition that Julius Caesar built the tower? Or are there documented evidence? Is there documented evidence for it? Is it in the record? Well, when we think of Shakespeare and the classical influence, I suppose we would immediately say, yes, Shakespeare and the classics, those Roman plays, his early tragedy, Titus Andronicus, and then his plays, Julius Caesar, Antony and Cleopatra, Coriolanus. Those three plays based on Plutarch's Lives of the Noble Grecians and Romans, another text which was translated into English in Shakespeare's time. Indeed, Shakespeare's friend Richard Field, his master, the master printer that Field worked for, he was the person who printed the English translation of Plutarch's Lives that gave Shakespeare his source for Julius Caesar, Antony and Cleopatra, Coriolanus. But actually, if you look at the full body of Shakespeare's works, the 36 plays in the first folio, his collected works put together by his fellow actors after his death, and then think also of the two collaborative plays left out of the folio, Pericles, co-written with George Wilkins, Two Noble Kinsmen, co-written with John Fletcher, and then those two narrative poems printed by Richard Field. In all, Shakespeare writes about 40 works. And of those, a third of them, 13 of them, are set in the world of classical antiquity. Some of the lesser known plays, excuse me, like Timon of Athens and Troilus and Cressida, as well as those Roman plays and the poems of Two Noble Kinsmen. It's a huge proportion of Shakespeare's plays. So how exactly does Shakespeare use the classics? Well, yes, in those cases, he derives his sources. The stories come from classical antiquity. And This was also the case for many of the other dramatists. So, for example, Christopher Marlowe, collaborating with another dramatist called Thomas Nash, wrote a play called The Tragedy of Dido, Queen of Carthage, a story directly based on the Aeneid. Indeed, the scene in the Aeneid where Aeneas tells Dido the story of the siege of Troy and his escape from Troy is almost literally translated by Marlowe into the tragedy of Dido, Queen of Carthage. Then from the navel to the throat at once he ripped old Priam, at whose latter gasp Jove's marble statue 'gan to bend the brow, as loathing Pyrrhus for this wicked act. Yet he undaunted took his father's flag and dipped it in the old king's chill cold blood, and then in triumph ran into the streets through which he could not pass for slaughtered men. So leaning on his sword he stood stone still, viewing the fire wherewith rich Ilion burnt. Pyrrhus, the son of Achilles, avenging by killing old Priam and then running in violence through the streets of Troy. Extraordinarily vivid passage in the Aeneid, translated, say, pretty closely into the tragedy of Dido, Queen of Carthage. The idea of the son avenging the father's death. Powerful idea. When the actors come to Elsinore, you remember Hamlet says to the lead actor, give us a speech. Give us a speech. What speech would you like? The story of Pyrrhus. And the player speaks in this rather old-fashioned, sort of elevated style. In some senses, I think what's going on here is Shakespeare is parodying the language of Marlowe. So in the player's speech, we get the idea of Pyrrhus finding Priam, Reverend Priam, but then there's a kind of freeze frame effect in the middle of the speech, and you can see it by the way the iambic pentameter line, the 5-beat line, has a break. Pyrrhus stands over the figure of old Priam, and like a neutral to his will and matter, did nothing. And there's a pause there. And then, but as we often see against some storm, a silence for heaven, it's kind of the lull before the storm, if you like. There's a pause. And then after that pause, during which an elaborate simile is developed, and where did the Cyclops' hammer fall? On Mars, his armour forged for proof etern, with less remorse than Pyrrhus' bleeding sword, now falls on Priam. So hold up the sword, pause for an elaborate bit of poetic simile, and then down comes the sword. That elaborate extended simile we call an epic simile. I'm sure those of you who have taught Homer have looked again and again at these extended similes. And we see them, of course, in the Aeneid as well. There's an example here, again, the case of Pyrrhus in the Aeneid. What I've put up on the screen there is the Elizabethan translation of the Aeneid. Again, the elaborate simile. Now, just think for a moment of that image. Pyrrhus avenging his father's death by bringing down the sword. Does it remind you of something later in the play? Shakespeare, by having the player speak the Pyrrhus speech, has put into his audience mind that idea, the sword will pause, and then down it will come in murder. It's a painting of exactly that moment. A very famous scene then. But when it comes to Hamlet, he doesn't put down the sword. You remember the scene? It's after the players have played out the play and Hamlet has discovered for sure that it was indeed Claudius who killed his father. And then he has the opportunity to kill him. The illustration here is from the Royal Shakespeare Company with David Tennant as Hamlet, Patrick Stewart as Claudius. And you remember, he holds up the sword, but does nothing. The sword does not come down. And later, of course, Hamlet will sort of chide himself for saying, Pyrrhus did it, I didn't do it. Of course, there is an argument, and this is a great thing to debate in the classroom. Why doesn't Hamlet kill Claudius at that moment? One argument would say, well, Hamlet is being really ruthless. The reason he doesn't do it, and this is what he says, is because Claudius is praying, and therefore Claudius is repenting, and he might be sending him to heaven, whereas Claudius didn't give old Hamlet the chance to repent because he killed him while he was asleep. That's a kind of brutal Hamlet, a Hamlet who really wants to see through the act of revenge like Pyrrhus. But another argument is Hamlet is so hesitant. He doesn't want to reduce himself to the moral level of Claudius. He wants to leave judgment to God. He wants to be more humane. And maybe that's why he doesn't bring down the sword. So the kind of negative Pyrrhus image, if you like, gives an opportunity for two different interpretations. And of course, that is the great richness of Shakespeare, the way that you can interpret it in so many different ways. And that's why it's such a wonderful resource for class debate. What I hope I've showed in this lecture is that the classical tradition is, in every sense, alive. That as Shakespeare learnt his craft of language, his craft of debate, his ability to move between tragical, comical, historical, pastoral, every aspect of human experience, to dramatize on stage for a broad audience. Remember, you only needed to pay a penny to come into the theatre. To dramatize on stage every aspect of human experience, the relationship between parents and children, the conflicts between private desire and public duty, the relationship between government and individual, to understand the past in order to build a better future. These are all things that Shakespeare learnt from the classical tradition. Since Shakespeare's time, the classical tradition has evolved. That is indeed, for me, the definition of a classic, not something that is fixed, but something that evolves and stays alive. I sometimes compare this process to Darwin's idea of evolution by natural selection. You remember Darwin says the species that survive are those that adapt to new environmental circumstances. In the same way, a classic is something that survives through cultural evolution. What we mean by a classic is a text that speaks to every age, that as new challenges come along, new cultural, historical, social, political circumstances come along, the classic text still speaks to them. And that is what keeps the classics alive. Now, of course, in Shakespeare's time, the classical education that he got was purely the classics of antiquity. It was very much built on this idea of trying to make England into a new Rome, the idea that the foundation of European culture came from ancient Rome, and prior to that from Greece. And of course, the other aspect of this is what I think of as the kind of the dialogue between Athens and Rome on the one hand, Jerusalem on the other, the way in which the Christian tradition intersects with the classical tradition. Whenever we think of Rome in Shakespeare's time, one's thinking of classical antiquity, the Roman Republic, and then the move to the Roman imperial phase and the dangers of civil war and all those things Shakespeare dramatizes in a play like Julius Caesar. But Rome is also associated with the Roman Catholic Church, and in Shakespeare's time, because of the Protestant Reformation, there's a conflict there. But the texts that they studied in school were those of antiquity. And that remained the case in elite education for a long time, right through the rest of the 17th, the 18th century. A writer like John Milton would also have been grounded in the classics. But then in the course of the 18th century, Shakespeare himself, together with Milton, became a vernacular classic, an English classic. And there's a very interesting kind of evolution in the course of the 18th century. I write about this in the final chapter of my book on how the classics made Shakespeare, a process by which Shakespeare himself became a classic. To go to Oxford or Cambridge, to go to an elite university, you had to subscribe to the Articles of the Church of England. In the course of the 18th century, religious dissenters, Methodists, Baptists, nonconformists, refused to do that, and therefore were excluded from Oxford and Cambridge, where the education was still in Latin and Greek. And so it was that new academies emerged. The first one was up in Warrington in the northwest of England. The famous scientist Joseph Priestley was involved with its foundation. And because those were meant for middle-class boys and now girls who didn't have the Latin language, they established English classics, Shakespeare, Milton, and they began to teach the poetry of Shakespeare and Milton, partly as a way of teaching eloquence, the art of eloquent speech to young people. What you saw with Eleanor's poetry recitation is exactly the kind of thing that those so-called dissenting academies fostered, were made for. So Shakespeare becomes a classic in that non-conformist educational moment in the 18th century. And our classical tradition today maintains the works of antiquity, but it also embraces Shakespeare, and then, of course, embraces the later writers who in so many ways were inspired by Shakespeare. This year is the 250th anniversary of the greatest of English novelists, Jane Austen, and there's a session on her tomorrow. There's a wonderful moment in her Mansfield Park where they read some Shakespeare, and the character says, everybody knows Shakespeare and quotes Shakespeare. Sometimes they know that they quote Shakespeare without even realizing it's Shakespeare, because Shakespeare, they say, is part of an Englishman's constitution. There's a real sense in which, as Shakespeare was constituted by the classics of Rome, so the whole of the later Western literary tradition was constituted by Shakespeare. Thank you very much.